Good morning. Good morning. There we go. All right. Week after week, we say good morning. It's just a friendly item, but it's a nice thing to do. Let's go ahead and get started with our Sunday school hour. Redeemed, everyone standing except Ruth.
Thank you for being here already, and we're glad that you're here. Some of you are here hungry. Some of you are here a little bit tired. I've heard that already a couple times, but you're here anyway. David Whitehead, would you lead us in prayer? Amen. You may be seated. Thank you, David. I made sure that I pointed so that I was accurate. If you've ever fallen prey to the mistaken call out for prayer, it stays with you. It happened to me in 1983, and I've never gotten over it. This is the 40th anniversary. Could have been today, for all I know. It could be the anniversary. The time that two of us started praying in College Chapel. Both first names Matt. And in fact, like the first 10 words that we both prayed were the same. And then it became a game of prayer chicken to see who will stop first. I lost. I stopped. My girlfriend at the time supported me for a very brief time and told me that it was me that was supposed to be called on. And at some point, she turned on me and said I was wrong and I didn't hear it correctly. And I married her anyway. It's true. You put me in a bind there. We're glad you're here. I'll give you a couple of announcements. That wasn't one that I planned on making. Hey, thank you for taking advantage. Several of you, we called this out last Sunday morning in Sunday school, and some of you did it right then, and I appreciate that because I think it'll be a help to you later. And some of you have taken advantage of it through the week, entering that phone number into your phone, gave us your name, so we already have you in the bank. And then throughout the week, I've had 2 or 3 people that just requested prayer. This is going to streamline things so that you don't have to remember it until Sunday, and when you tell me as I pass from the front to the back, I don't have to remember it on Monday. It's in the system, and hopefully we've responded quickly enough to you as you enter that. So if you are in need of that, now you've entered it in your phone as NTBC prayer. I will tell you this, that in the future, we're going to broaden that to other uses. That will be the number that we use. You can text us that way. For now, you texted in the word prayer. You're in that channel. We can do it with some other things as well if you'd like to tell us. One of the things I didn't put it in the bulletin today is, one of the things I'd like you to do, and we may even give you some space in the bulletin, or you could just find a blank space towards the back, is if in the course of a Sunday you hear a phrase, a statement, a comment that is made from the pulpit that especially is meaningful to you, if you would jot that down and respond to us with that. The reason being is we're going to try to make use of what is said on Sunday in a broader context, and we did this some time ago, even on Instagram, taking some portions of the sermons. But this would streamline it. It would help us to know where to go look. If something that was a statement, comment, you don't have to write it down verbatim because I'm not going to slow down and stop and wait for you to write it down. If you get enough of it that we could link to it or tell us that, it's at the end of this or right before this, we can go look for it because it is a rather time-consuming process to take clips out of the Sunday morning service to find it. You've got to listen through it or scan through it or fast forward through it, and that's not something I'm looking to add to my schedule. So if you find something that is especially meaningful in the course of a Sunday, jot it down, the first 5 words, tell us where it's at, and we can go look for it. It would be really easy if it's exactly like I had it in my notes, but it's not. It doesn't always come out exactly as I have it in my notes. If it's that way, I can go look for it. Anyway, if you do that, that may be something we add to that phone number along with registering for events and things like that. But several of you did it. I just want to say thank you. We've got your name in the system. And then again, we've had some comments today. Pray for these people. I gave the gospel to them in this situation, and we were able to pray for it immediately. So that's a good help. Christmas shoeboxes are available. Operation Christmas Child is rapidly moving towards the middle of November. And in fact, we are rapidly moving towards November. We'll be there in the middle of this week. And so if you are going to participate, take one of those boxes. We're shooting for the 12th. We have a little bit of leeway on that, but that'll be the Sunday that we designate towards that Sunday night, the 12th. We'll put together a bunch of boxes, so if you'd like to help us with that, take some boxes now, return them at your convenience, or wait till the 12th, that's fine as well. If you'd like to give towards the Paris evangelism event at the Olympics next year, there's some information in the bulletin about how you can do that, and again, simply designate toward Paris if you'd like to help with that on your giving. The Sun Coasters are meeting on Thursday. Breakfast will be served at 9 a.m. That's a Canva issue. That's not a us issue. Canva did something with it. It's easy to blame them. It's just a website. And so you get information in there about the calendar and such like that. Grief share on Monday nights. And I had another announcement, but I've forgotten it already. Quiz. I remember the other announcement. I'll make it in just a second. How many of you think you represented the message of that song well by the way that you sang it? Raise your hand. Did you? I looked it up while you were singing All That Thrills My Soul is Jesus, and I looked up the definition of thrill. To cause someone to experience a strong feeling of enjoyable excitement, to experience a surge of excitement or pleasure, to move or to pass so as to cause a sudden wave of emotion, great excitement, happiness. There's a medical term. I don't think that has anything to do with it. A very exciting or enjoyable event or experience. I'll just leave it at that. I'm not going to add commentary to it, but when we sing All That Thrills My Soul is Jesus, let's not flatline doing it. I left my Sunday school. I was so consumed with that, I brought these over. The announcement is for tonight. The announcement is about tonight, and we want you to hear it. So if you didn't hear the other announcements, you got to pay attention to this one, because some of you, there have been people last time we did this last quarter who came to the auditorium and didn't know anything was going on, even though all of our cars were here. We will be in the cafe tonight. It's the 5th Sunday of the month, and that happens quarterly, roughly. We will be in the cafe tonight. That announcement's non-bulletin. We'll try to remind you of that. We'll be in the cafe tonight. We will have food. It is not what some of you ordered. But you will be able to eat tonight, so if that affects your afternoon plans, we'll have some snack sandwiches and desserts and sodas and such like that. So we'll meet in the cafe. We'll have a brief little video that we'll talk about, a reminder video, a teaching video, as it were, and we'll talk about forgiveness and being able to put the past in the past. This little humorous video I found. We'll share that tonight. But we will be in the cafe. How many of you just heard the words that came out of my mouth and you understood them in the English language? If you come to that door and shrug and then text me afterwards, Pastor, I don't know where anybody was. I came. Don't do it. That's how I hear the tone, by the way, in the texts. We're in Mark chapter 11. It's a a good day to be in the Lord's house, and we have the scripture we can learn and grow and change as we read it, and I hope that we will do that. Now, I just gave you a little, I don't know what we'll call that, a little challenge with regard to our singing. We are singing some really incredibly good songs this morning in the morning service, and I heard the choir was practicing, and I heard them rehearsed at home, and we're singing that newer one that we've learned, Come Behold the Wondrous Mystery, that you've learned in the last few weeks, and of the true and better Adam. We sing through the whole life of Christ in that song. Let's sing that in an appropriate engagement. Forever Jesus Christ, our sure and steady anchor. We will talk about the goodness and greatness of God, our desperate need for salvation, and the great gift that he has provided to us in our singing this morning. So let's be good witnesses of that. By the way, that will be, if we fail that in the singing time, you'll be especially convicted in the preaching of it, because we're going to talk this morning in the 10:30 hour about managing the message. In other words, we are stewards or managers, and God has entrusted to his children the incredible message of salvation. He's entrusted to you, child of God, with the gospel and given you a commissioning. And the question goes out to us today, how well are we doing with that? Are we keeping it to ourselves? Are we selfish and stingy? Do we rejoice in it when we come in these walls and we're satisfied in it? That's a wonderful start, but it's never been designed. The gospel has never been designed to stop with a believer. It's never been designed to end once you received it. It's always been designed for it to carry on to someone in your realm of influence. All right, well, that's the 10:30, so you still have to stay. We'll look through. I told you on Wednesday, I think, or I don't know, I think I told some of you to be ready in the book of 1 Corinthians this morning. We're going to look at Paul's consideration of that. So we'll be at several texts. It'll be a great study for you to be on YouVersion if you struggle to find verses. We looked them up for you. But we are in the Gospel of Mark now as we move towards the end of it. We are in chapter 11 this morning. Last week we saw Jesus moving towards Jerusalem, leading out in front of his disciples, even though he had just told them of what was awaiting them or awaiting him in Jerusalem. And that was that he would be taken captive, and he would be mocked, and he would be spat upon, and he would be killed and crucified. And so he led the way towards Jerusalem. And we come to chapter 11, and he enters into Jerusalem. Mark continues this counting of his trip there towards the cross. But instead of going straight into Jerusalem, he goes to Bethany. It's likely as he stops in Bethany, he stays at the home of Lazarus, Martha, and Mary, as was his custom. And Bethany is just a short distance from the city of Jerusalem. And it provides easy access to one of Jesus' favorite spots, his favorite locations. That would be the Garden of Gethsemane on the Mount of Olives. Much happened there on the Mount of Olives. Much happens and will happen in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus sends two of his disciples into the city in chapter 11 to prepare for his arrival. He tells them that there is a particular donkey that they would find at a particular location. And they found that just as Jesus described, and the owner was ready to give that over to their usage when he found out that it was Jesus who desired to use it. When they return, Jesus gets on the animal and he begins what is known as the triumphal entry, chapter 11, verses 4 through 10. And often we note that the people who are in the crowd that day in chapter 11, singing Hosanna and shouting his praise as he enters in Jerusalem, some of those likely are part of the crowd later that will call for his crucifixion. There is a dramatic, intense turnabout in this week of time. Jesus goes back to Bethany for the night, but he comes back to Jerusalem the next day, and that's where we pick up. He goes back to Jerusalem after having entered it. We want to talk this morning about the obstacles to prayer. What are some things or warning signs that might indicate that you have an unhealthy prayer life? Well, I think the number one sign of an unhealthy prayer life is that you don't pray. Maybe you would agree. That's probably a pretty good indicator. Some of us might expound on that and say that you don't pray enough, or that our prayers are thin or shallow, if you know what I mean by that. There's no depth to them. They're meaningless. How about thoughtless prayers? We can pray without thinking. We can say words without the depth of meaning in our hearts. We have a lot of indicators for that. Prayer getting shoved out of our schedule for things that must be more important to us. So there are some indicators here. Prayer is an activity that can and should turn into a lifestyle, but everyone struggles with obstacles that get in the way of our prayer times. We're going to look at some of those obstacles today. It can be as ordinary, as I've said, a busy schedule can be an obstacle to prayer, or as broad and deep as someone misunderstanding the nature of who God is and how we come to him or why we come to him, how he wants to relate to us. If people believe that God desires no personal fellowship with you, then your prayer life is going to struggle. You're not going to have the meaningful prayer that others who see God as their Father, who longs for us to reach out, call out. That person has the opportunity to have much more meaningful prayer. And so in chapter 11, we're going to see three struggles, as it were, obstacles that we can remove, things that we can take to heart to make our prayer life more healthy and active. Jesus proves how seriously he takes obstacles to prayer in chapter 11. He's going to cleanse the temple of God. And in doing so, he's going to demonstrate a zeal for God's house. And the reason is, it's unlikely that if you went to the temple that day that you could easily pray and worship God. There'd be a lot of obstacles to that. By the way, we could take that to heart here today. What am I doing that might be an obstacle to others? What am I doing that might be distracting to what we're here to do. And that's what we see in chapter 11. They come into the temple. There are things going on, people practicing things every day, and Jesus says, we're not able to do what we're supposed to do by this taking place, and so he cleanses the temple. And then we'll see religious leaders who were so consumed with jealousy that became an obstacle. And then at the close of this, he's going to do something miraculous, and he's going to remind his disciples that he can do anything. If we come, by the way, I should have mentioned this first. One of the obstacles to prayer is that we don't believe God's going to answer it. We have no faith. We're just saying words. We don't believe he can. We don't believe he's interested. We don't believe he's on top of things, or however we might view that. If we have that mindset, our prayer life is going to significantly struggle. So we're in chapter 11 of Mark, chapter 11, beginning at verse 15. We're going to look at the conditions for answered prayer, and I want you to think about that when we come to these. How might these appear in your own life, or in the life of our community here as a body of believers? And we should be active in removing them from our lives and understand these three adjectives that we see here. There are three adjectives in this text that talk about the narrative here of Jesus as he begins to cleanse the temple. The adjective number one is zealous. Jesus is zealous towards prayer. You have a zeal towards something, you will do what it takes if you're zealous about it. How many of you have something in your life that you're zealous about? Anybody want to confess something? Now, if you're going to go all spiritual in Sunday school, we all know what these answers are. Outside of church, is anyone zealous about anything that we can? Dawn, are you zealous about anything? Taxes? I thought you were going to say the bucks. Man, taxes. Zealous about taxes. All right. Yes, ma'am. Genealogy. So do you spend time with that? Yeah. Have you ever traveled to do genealogy or interviewed people? Yeah. So, these are type things that we do. Anybody else? You're zealous about that? Genealogy and taxes. I'm going to be honest. Those were not on my bingo card this morning of things that were zealous. That's great. I love it. Anybody else? Lee? Smoked meat. Who was I with? Was somebody here the day when I led with I was smoking? And then, it was at Culver's last Sunday night. A bunch of rotten people. I was at the table and I said something about smoking meat, and apparently I paused too long between smoking and meat, and I got all kind of grief. Apparently it was the day before. You did some ribs. He did a bunch of, what did you do, pork, brisket, and all kind of stuff? Ribs, pork, and beef. That's a full restaurant. I did chicken for the week. You got it all. My granddaughter likes to. They just shred it and put it in her little thing for lunch. We're all set. You're a bit passionate about that, zealous towards that, right? Lee, have you ever gotten up early to smoke meat for the day? Yeah, well, like what time? See, you got to be really committed if you do that, right? I mean, you got to really love it. Anybody else, you're committed to anything, zealous about anything? Here's the point. We will do things out of the ordinary if we're really zealous about something. I have a soccer team from Great Britain that I watch. They're playing right now, but I'm still in Sunday school, therefore I'm zealous. No. And when I was up at camp, I drove to Atlanta to watch them play because it would be much cheaper than going to England, right? So I went somewhere, I paid money because I'm zealous about something. And it means there is a level of excitement, commitment, devotion to something. It's not halfway in our lives. It's not we can take it or leave it. We're devoted to it. Look at verse 15. They come to Jerusalem. And Jesus went into the temple and began to cast out them that sold and bought in the temple, and overthrew the tables of the money changers and the seats of them that sold doves, and would not suffer that any man should carry any vessel through the temple. And he taught them, saying unto them, Is it not written, My house shall be called of all nations a house of prayer, but ye have made it a den of thieves. You all have a picture in your head when I read those verses. This is an important event, so much so that the gospel writers all include it. John places it a little different in time in his record of it. This is known as the overturning of the tables, the casting out of the money changers, Jesus' zeal in the house of God. Verse 15 says that he cast out. This event takes place in an area of the temple known as the court of the Gentiles. This place in the outer workings of the temple is as far as a non-Jew could go in the temple complex. But I want to point something out to you, and we say this often. God's relationship with his people has always been designed to incorporate other nations. Abraham is told at the very beginning, your purpose in being the father of a great nation is to be a light to all the nations. You are called, Israel has been called to be a light to the nations. The Jewish temple was designed so that non-Jewish worshipers could come and worship. The design was that they would devote themselves to Jehovah. They would pray. There was an outer court where the Gentiles could do it. Jesus had been there the day before. After entering into the city, he had observed, he had soaked in all that was going on in the courtyard. He'd seen it, and he noticed that instead of it being a place of prayer and worship, he saw that it had become nothing more than a marketplace and a stockyard. And it burned within him. How many of you have ever seen something and perhaps didn't respond immediately, and the longer that you pondered it, the more troubling it became? Jesus has been here the day before, and he's seen all of this. And perhaps that night as he goes out into Bethany, he mulls it over in his heart. He speaks about it to the disciples. We don't know, that's not in the scripture. But then he comes back into there, and it is too much. Doesn't belong here. And so Jesus, in his zeal, takes on the problem. And this was a problem for prayer. He saw that the courtyard has a marketplace in it. Travelers from all over came to buy animals for the sacrifices during the Passover. Well, you imagine what this is like. Imagine the noise levels. Imagine the distractions that are going on. Imagine the creation of a different environment than prayer. Now, I'm not saying that prayer has to be in silence. I'm not saying that you have to be all the time. Prayer can't happen anywhere than in a place of complete silence. You should be able to pray in any condition. You should be able to pray in a stadium full of people. But the point was, this place was designed for that. This place was designed to draw people's attention to the Father in an atmosphere of worship and prayer. And what was happening, that wasn't it at all. Over all this noise, Jesus began forcing the merchants and their livestock out of the area. He is challenging as well when he does this the authority of the high priest. Who's in charge of this area? Who's in charge of this courtyard? The high priest. He's in his territory, as it were, humanly speaking, but he's in his Father's house. And he begins to drive them out. It's noteworthy that this event is recorded in all the Gospels, and it takes place in the court of the Gentiles. The narrative also affirms that God's plan is for the Messiah to draw all people to him. Again, we all always look at Peter's a moment with the sheet coming down and being able to eat all the meat, right? And that was the open door to the Gentiles, or perhaps the Apostle Paul's ministry when he goes from the synagogue and turns his attention to the Gentiles. This has always been God's purpose, is to reach the world, all nations, with the good news of salvation. Verse 15 tells us that there, in addition to the selling of the animals, there are some money changers. The merchants in the courtyard were there because travelers needed to exchange their Roman and their Greek coins for Jewish coins. The only coins that the merchants would accept were these Jewish coins, and so they would come from other regions, and once they got there, without a sacrifice, they would need to first exchange their money and then go purchase the animal for sacrifice. How many of you have ever changed money and found out that you didn't get as much as you thought you were? Exchange it for foreign currency. You ever watch somebody exchange it on the way in, get too much money and exchange it on the way out? I've been with way too many young people. They exchange it all on the way in, don't spend it all, and then exchange it on the way out. Do you know how much you lost on both ends of that deal? These people here, if we can use the colloquialism, had them over a barrel. You don't have another choice. You don't have options all around. You had these people, and you were going to have to abide by the Old Testament law to provide a proper sacrifice, and so you needed the proper exchange currency, and so you were over a barrel. What do you imagine that the money changers did with the rate? If you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, you go into some places this is a little bit different, but if you've ever traveled overseas, the first thing you do when you get your bags and you get through customs, there'll be an exchange little booth right there. Their rate is not going to be the same as a bank outside, but you need that money now. So they say, well, our rate's different. You go out here. By the way, we did this one time in Venezuela where the government sets the currency exchange, but the people on the street don't acknowledge it. So the government says it cannot be any different for the U.S. dollar because they don't want the people, or they didn't want the people having U.S. dollars that way, but people wanted them. And so, actually, the pastor did it. You just had a guy on the street that would exchange the money in Venezuela. My wife was not a big fan of that, so I didn't do it. Someone else did it for me. In Peru and Lima, you go and there are people with little vests, and they're on the street, and they're the recognized currency exchanger. You can do it right there on the street. Other places, you have to go into a bank, show your passport, do all of that, have uncreased bills. These people just said, you don't have another choice, and so the rate is through the roof. You're not getting very much back. They were the usury, as we would say, in a form here, taking advantage of the people, an exorbitant rate. The second thing we see in verse 15 is that they sold doves, perhaps pigeons here, as a part of the practices and the sacrifices at the temple. If you had a child, ladies, the women would bring the dove to make a sacrifice after the birth of a child. Lepers or others who had been diseased and had been healed would offer a sacrifice of this animal. Cattle and sheep were likely available, but you had to be able to afford that, and most of the people there couldn't afford it. So you would find that least expensive animal. And then the interesting thing that says in verse 16, Jesus would not suffer or would not allow that any man should carry any vessel through the temple. You have to do a little research here and digging to find out what it means. Mark's the only gospel writer that talks about this aspect. He alludes to the fact that people were using the courtyard of the Gentiles as a shortcut to get from one side of the town to the other. You could just pass through the outer workings of the temple to get there. So it's not only money changers, it's not only a stockyard, but now it's a shortcut. It's a thoroughfare. People are carrying their things from one side of Jerusalem to the other and cutting through. Meanwhile, someone has come there, perhaps at a little bit of distance, and great effort and great sacrifice and great financial input, and said, I want to worship God. Moo. I'm not doing birds, right? And coins playing around. And people, have you ever been to a market where they shout you out, you know? We first went out of the country when we were on our honeymoon, and we still joke about it. Every market around the world is all the same. They don't call us this anymore, but when we were first married, they go, honeymooners. You know, they're trying to sell you a marble chess set made in China, but you're buying it in Mexico, or however that works. And they're hawking for your business. Come here and change with me. I've got the finest doves here. You know what a marketplace sounds like. This is what it sounds like. And then you have people traipsing through there. And Jesus sees it, and it's too much. Because the person who has come there to legitimately bow and worship before God and commune with Jehovah can't do it well. Jesus is very zealous about this. Verse 17, notice his statement. He taught them. It's a very nice way to say it. If you read the other Gospels where he's overturning tables and driving some out with a whip, he taught them, saying, is it not written? So he begins by quoting here. Isaiah chapter 56, verse 7. The prophet declared, God's house is to be a house of prayer. Is it not written, my house shall be called of all nations, the house of prayer, but ye have made it a den of thieves. Jesus knew that God's house was anything but a peaceful haven for worship. Mark is also the only gospel writer who includes that phrase, of all nations. Of all nations, as part of Jesus' quote, affirming the fact that Jesus had come for everyone, not just a select few. A den of thieves here. Jeremiah is the quotation here, Jeremiah 7:11. Jeremiah called out those who were going to the temple with wrong motives and wrong attitudes, and Jesus now calls out those who have turned the temple into a den of thieves. He is zealous about proper atmosphere in prayer, devoted in prayer. Listen, you go through the motions, don't expect there to be great power or meaning in your prayer. If you just do it combined with a bunch of other things, it's lacking. It's an obstacle. It's a hindrance. Be zealous about protecting genuine prayer. Time. You have to protect time to do that. You have to protect your mind to do that, right? I mean, and again, please don't discount this. Peter, out walking on the water, begins to sink. He doesn't pull aside to a proper place, bow down on his knees, cross his hands like a child, bow his head to pray. He says, Lord, save me. It's a prayer. Listen, if you're driving the car, don't close your eyes. You can pray while you drive the car. It's not the best place, but it's a good place. You need to be protective of your mind, to shut out other things, distractions, things that would clamor for your attention. Be zealous like Jesus did, but don't be jealous. Number 2, the adjective in verses 18 and 19, like the religious leaders. How well do you think this went over with the religious leaders? You're overstepping your boundaries, Jesus. This is the territory of the high priest. By the way, they had a pursuit of Jesus from his first days of ministry. Verse 18, the scribes and the chief priests heard it and sought how they might destroy him. This is not new, but you can see it building to a head. This is before the cross. They sought how they might destroy him. Why? For they feared him, because all the people were astonished at his doctrine. When even was come, he went out of the city. This is a very brief passage here, but Jesus, as we see elsewhere in the Gospels, taught like no other person taught. Jesus had an authority in his speech that they could not muster up. Jesus had an impact in the lives of people that they had never had in their entire life of ministry as a chief priest or scribe. Jesus accomplished things in people's lives that they'd never seen before, and they knew it. He had a power that they didn't have, and they were jealous. The scribes and the chief priests in verse 18, these religious leaders, Mark records that people were amazed and astonished at his teaching, which caused even more concern for them. They're jealous of Jesus' popularity, and now they're upset with the way that he redefines the law, as well as their own interpretation and rituals of the law. Jesus was teaching something contrary to their additions and manipulations of the law. Jesus spoke truth. Verse 18 tells us that they sought to destroy him. This is a collision here of pride, jealousy, and fear. And they all collided in the hearts of these religious leaders. Emotions have a way of diverting our attention away from what's really important. Emotions, when they take over, when emotions get behind the steering wheel, buckle up because you're in for a ride. They're not picking the best way to go, but they'll pick the shortcut. Emotions begin to take over. While these religious leaders should have been focusing on prayer, they should have been focusing on teaching the Word of God faithfully and properly. Their attention is consumed with the elimination of the threat of Jesus. That's all I can think about. They laid their head down at night, consumed with how they could take him out. They woke up in the morning ready to put it into practice. We see early in Jesus' ministry, if we go back to Mark chapter 3, the Pharisees had conspired with the Herodians. This was the upper crust of Jewish society which supported the ruler Herod Antipas. They sought to destroy him. Why? They didn't like his popularity. For some of them, it was very simple. It wasn't a religious, meaningful law disagreement, and for some of them it was. But for some of it was they just hated him being more popular. They hated him attracting crowds. Verse 18 says that the people were astonished. Verse 18, for they feared him because all the people were astonished at his doctrine. It's interesting because last week we saw these two emotions used with the crowd of disciples as Jesus headed toward Jerusalem. They feared and they were astonished. What were they fearing on that day? They were fearing what the high priests and scribes were going to do to him. Remember, Jesus is leading the way, not in the back to see what kind of a climate it is before he gets there. He's walking ahead of them, having just told them, I'm going here, they're going to put hands on me, they're going to arrest me, they're going to mock me and beat me and kill me. And yet he's leading the way, and they feared and were astonished. Here it's a different group. The religious leaders are fearing because the people were astonished at his doctrine. The Greek word there for fear is phobeo, from which we get the English word phobia. And it can mean, elsewhere in Scripture, to hold in high reverence, to fear God. But it doesn't mean that here. It means the straight-out terrify or dread. They were scared that what they had built over their whole lifetime was going to go away because of this dynamic, charismatic, powerful teacher. He's drawing the crowds away from them. That's it. They were just scared. And the Bible says in verse 19, when even was come, Jesus didn't cause a scene there at the temple and then run away to avoid the retaliation of Jewish leaders. He stays. He teaches. The crowds hear him give truth throughout the day. And as was his custom when it was evening, they left. The fact that Jesus allows himself to be so long in the public eye teaches us something. It teaches us his great trust in the Father's plan. Class, help me out after last week. Does Jesus know that he's going to die on a cross? Yes, he's taught him that. Does Jesus know that he's going to be arrested and beaten and mocked? Yes, he does. He knows the timing of this. Can I just add another? Does Jesus know that he will observe the Passover with his disciples? Yes, he does. Here he understands. They're angry, they're upset, they're out to get me, but nothing is going to happen to me outside of the Father's plan. And when it does happen, it has to happen. I'm willing for it. I embrace it happening. So he doesn't, and you have to understand that he's created this scene in the temple, and the buzz is going throughout the crowd. You have to know that the religious leaders are going to be upset. Let's get out of here. No. He stays throughout the course of the day. He teaches, he ministers to these people who need to hear truth. Because they're not going to hear it from the religious leaders. And when the day is done and the evening has come, then he leaves. Things have closed up for the day. In reality, while the leaders are terrified of him, Jesus has no reason to be afraid of his opponents. The time of his death is coming, but it's only ever going to happen in accordance with the Father's plan of salvation. Nothing was ever going to be out of place. These people, as angry as they were, thinking, by the way, in the next days, thinking that they had accomplished their task, have done nothing other than accomplish God's task. They were just pawns. So there's a great jealousy. By the way, jealousy will hinder your prayer life. Focus on the wrong things will hinder your prayer life. Concern for the affairs of others more than your own will hinder your prayer life. God begins to convict you over something that you read in Scripture, you hear preached or taught, and your concern then is how others are going to apply it. You've missed it. You've missed the opportunity. I know so-and-so really needs to get right with God. I know so-and-so really needs, listen, there's a place and time for praying for others, and it typically should follow after we've done that for ourselves first. The third thing, the miraculous. Verse 20, I'm going to read the whole text here, 20 through 25. In the morning they pass by, and you have to understand that they've seen this fig tree before. Right before the text we read today in verse 15, verse 11 and following, I believe, is they see this fig tree, and Jesus curses it. Verse 20, in the morning, as they passed by, they saw the fig tree dried up from the roots. And Peter, calling to remembrance, saith unto him, Master, behold, the fig tree which thou cursest is withered away. You have to kind of hear how Peter's saying this with shock and amazement. Can you believe that? How does a tree die from the roots up in a day? I mean, you got some pretty strong topical applications of weed killers and stuff like that. It ain't even going to do that. This big tree that bore fruit, bore figs, has been dried up from the roots. Peter is incredulous when he says, Lord, would you check that out? By the way, think of that statement too. Lord, that thing you said just happened. Can you believe it? That's the nature of what's happening here. Of course it happened. Jesus spoke it. Verse 22, Jesus answering saith unto him, have faith in God. This was a teaching moment. Jesus doesn't say, why are you surprised? He points out the problem of why. Have faith in God. Where's my phone? Is he out there already? Okay. Verse 23, for verily I say unto you, that whosoever shall say unto this mountain, be thou removed and be cast into the sea, and shall not doubt in his heart, but shall believe that those things which he saith shall come to pass, he shall have whatsoever he saith. Therefore I say unto you, what things soever ye desire, when ye pray, believe that ye receive them, and ye shall have them. When you stand praying, forgive, if ye have aught against any, that your Father also which is in heaven may forgive you your trespasses. This is a great teaching here. So the fig tree that they passed earlier, Jesus had cursed in verses 12 through 14, surprised at how it has deteriorated so quickly, Peter points it out to Jesus. Now, some scholars believe that Jesus is using the tree as an illustration of the destruction of the temple, the withering away. In AD 70, the Romans destroy it. It's cursed, it's desolate, it's broken down. The context here really points to what he's trying to teach in verse 22. Have faith in God. And Peter's not getting scolded like he really could have been. Well, why are you so surprised I said that? No, Jesus redirects him. Look at the Father. Have faith in God. Yes, he's God in the flesh. But when you pray with faith. Understand that God can do it. And then he uses this teachable moment in verse 23 to explain why steadfast faith in God is so important. He is standing on the Mount of Olives, and he is looking out across and down into the Dead Sea. And he says those words in verse 23. Whosoever shall say unto this mountain, be removed and cast into the sea. They're standing on the Mount of Olives, they're gazing out towards the Dead Sea. If you said it, if you proclaimed and prayed in faith that there is power in God, that this could be moved into the sea. What? I mean, if you thought the fittered, I didn't say wig tree. I was fixing to, the withered fig tree. If you think that's something, do you know the power in prayer to God? Do you know the power with faith attached to prayer that God can do anything? Believe that ye receive. He encourages his followers to ask freely and to believe that God is going to hear. What's this hindrance that he's teaching here in the miraculous? He's teaching that a lack of faith will destroy your prayer life. They're mantras at that point. They're ritualistic sayings. They're things shouted at the wind or whispered to the breeze. Not prayer, because there's no faith attached to it. I imagine that if we're all honest, we've experienced that type of prayer in our own lives. Prayer that's not attached to faith. By the way, don't be shocked when nothing comes of that prayer. That's what Jesus teaches here. Believe that ye receive. And then Jesus points out one more to close. Other reason why our prayer life is hindered. And it's sin in general, and here it's forgiveness in particular. While you're praying this great prayer of faith, of the mountain being moved into the sea, cast into the sea, while you're praying that great prayer, you need to inspect your life. Because if you're harboring unforgiveness towards someone, it's going to damage the accomplishment of prayer. You're not going to experience what you could have. You've asked and received forgiveness from your Father. Those who have received it should be the ones who practice it to others. Don't be surprised when you're filled with grudges, when you're consumed with the perceived mistreatment of others and your revenge that one day will come. Don't be surprised that God is not eager to reward with an answer to prayer when you have been harboring that great grievance. Jesus says that very clearly in one of these last teaching moments to the disciples, the last days before the cross. Be mindful of how you forgive. We'll talk about that again tonight at 6 as we talk about our past coming back to visit us. But be mindful that we not allow that sin or any other into our life and then expect prayer to be phenomenal. These hindrances. Be zealous in protecting the realm of prayer in our life. Be careful of jealousy for the wrong reasons. These people were jealous of Jesus' ministry, and be mindful that God can and does do the miraculous, and he uses prayer to accomplish it. Father, help us to recognize that in our own lives. We often are weak, we're frail in our prayer life, and it's very often because we're negligent in prayer, that we're faithless in prayer. We're sinful in expecting you, a holy God, to call or reach out and answer, when in fact we need to reckon with you first. And I pray that you help us to be effective prayers. I pray that you help us to be intercessors on behalf of others in meaningful ways, not just praying for the surface, but for the depth of what can be accomplished in your work in our lives. I pray that you would